All right, welcome into Prime Suspects alongside Adam Bjorn and Prime Sports co-founder Joe Brennan Jr. I'm your host, Matt Landis. Today's topics: Prime's perspective on last week's SBC Americas conference and early action across the NFL and WNBA, the Wyoming Gaming Commission's determination that limiting is not a concern, and pending federal legislation that could change how the U.S. taxes gambling winnings. Kicking it off with the latest from Inside Prime Sports, SBC Americas held its conference last week in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. You guys were both there. So starting with Joe, what were the key conversations on the ground and what were your key takeaways from the event?
Well, it seemed like it was all performance contracts, all Kalshi, people debating back and forth, the viability, the model, how they were showing their numbers, their market makers' money behind them. A lot of people with a lot of opinions, and it seemed like also a lot of people also wanted to know, like, hey, do you know anybody over there? We'd like to do business with them. So, whatever your opinion is, they're definitely the brand of the moment, which is, I guess, ironic since Kalshi was nowhere near the event because, of course, they're not gambling, right? They're not sports betting. That was more or less the water cooler talk. There's a couple of panels on it as well. I do think it's interesting that you go to these things year after year after year. And then it's funny, the people who are the experts seem to be the same people all the time. Like right now, they're experts on performance contracts and DCMs. Like, a year ago, they were experts on sweeps. And before that, they're experts on iGaming, or they're experts on sportsbook, or they're experts on DFS, crypto, social gaming. Just rewind the tape. Some people, they use it as an opportunity. The news cycle's good to them to recreate their consulting business and their appearances at these panels. The only other one that really was like a big topic of conversation, of course, was iGaming, probably because in addition to it being a sports betting conference, they had everybody there. So, a lot of questions like, what's it going to take to get it over the line? What do you think of the different efforts in different states? Like, there's some efforts going on right now. There's not a whole lot of, I would say, firepower behind them right now. Kind of par for the course for iGaming, I would guess. But the biggest name was not anywhere in attendance at this conference.
Adam, building on Joe's comments, any top takeaways from your SBC Americas experience last week?
Yeah, TX Odds and Trev's Bar. I got there early, sat there. Anybody that needed to find me found me. Anybody that didn't need to find me didn't find me. I mean, it was really easy, and I hope that they continue on this tradition they've formed, because for me, by the end of the day, I believe half the conference, if not more, was at Trev's Bar having a Guinness or whatever else they fancied. For the rest of it, market makers, predictive models. I didn't go to a single seminar or whatever it was. I did hear there was a couple of heated ones, but my goal was very limited, very narrow, and I sort of achieved probably 95% of those things. It's usually the dinners and the drinks in the evenings that are the most productive. But again, I found my spot. I sat there most of the day, both days, and got everything out of it I needed.
Many thanks to Einar Noble and Thomas over at TX for alerting us ahead of time there was going to be A-OK for us to basically set up our stump there. But absolutely the best time. They said that booth was so successful. They had guys showing up at 10 o'clock in the morning the first day, ordering a Guinness and then giving their credit cards over. And they're like, no, mate, sorry. It's complimentary, but please tip the bartender. So it's definitely the best booth in the show.
And while you guys were set up there, the NFL schedule was released last Wednesday. Adam, following up on our segment last week about the schedule release, any games standing out in terms of the early action so far at Prime?
No, it was like, I did log in this morning to have a look, like next to zero volume. I looked through the lines. Miami had gone from +1 to -1. Arizona 4.5 to 5.5, and the rest of them are either exactly the same or moved half a point. Ravens Bills got some two-way action, and it's most heavily bet game with very little on it. But much ado about nothing on the NFL to this point. But anyone wanting to get a real bet, they're not going to show their hand now. There'll be instances where there's injuries in training camps and whatnot between now and then, retirements, whatever else that will change the numbers a little bit. But I'm sure if you get around and bet at 20 books, you can probably get on for a couple of $1,000, and no one's tipping their hand right now.
It is really interesting to read the chatter on betting Twitter. the theories already for those people who are indulging. As you might imagine, I particularly like the chatter around the Dallas coming to Philadelphia laying 7 at home, being able to raise their Super Bowl banner right over Jerry Jones. But I was particularly fascinated, and I went down this rabbit hole where Dallas is in a prime position to kick Philadelphia's ass because of the fatigue factor. Somehow Dallas being shitty and not making the playoffs is a significant advantage over Philadelphia because of, they played all those games and went to the Super Bowl and won it. I just love that kind of thinking. But you can't accuse the NFL of easing into the season when that's the one that they're kicking off with. And then the very next week, the Eagles go to the Chiefs for a rematch of the 2 Super Bowl contenders. So good, entertaining stuff.
And Adam, if the NFL hasn't gotten too much action so far, despite Joe's excitement for that Eagles-Cowboys game kicking off the season, let's try another sport here, the WNBA, tipping off seemingly with as much fanfare as ever. How does that translate to action Prime is seeing so far in the early going this season relative to previous years?
I mean, for all the hoopla on the women's sports, I get it. I appreciate it. For us, it's the equivalent of challenger tennis. Did look at last week's numbers. We did actually beat the Masters for 30% of hold, 6% on the rec, but it was like 2.5% volume versus the NBA, and I don't know how many NBA games there were versus how many WNBA games. Live v pre, 65% of the volume was on pre-game. But yeah, and comparing that to challenger tennis, that was like a 6th tennis life. So yeah, it's a nice sport. Not much else on this summer, so hopefully it'll pick up. But it's just one of those things that I just don't think, while it gets lots of noise and definitely public-wise, it's getting lots of boost on the betting side. It's the same old sort of playing into it from what we can see.
And Joe, speaking of that boost in public commentary, what are you seeing that stands out from WNBA bettors across gambling Twitter?
Well, I know, like, when I was still behind the desk there at Prime, we did get inquiries from people about, like, are you going to have WNBA? Are you going to, and then immediately we go to, like, are you going to have WNBA props? So there are some people who really want to see that needle move. But as you can imagine, the people who are asking for that are probably the guys that we're not going to make a whole lot of money from. It's going to take a few years for this all to settle in. Like, I think one of the things that particularly, we'll say, sports on the rise or trying to be on the rise here in the United States have to learn is just because you can bet on a thing doesn't make it popular. And this is something that you hear oftentimes, whether it's NASCAR, WNBA, some of the smaller sports, like, oh, if we have betting, it will definitely increase the popularity. And it's like, no, you're looking through the wrong end of the telescope. The popularity of sport will determine just how many people are really willing to bet on it. And the sport in WNBA, God love Angel and Caitlin kicking it off in style this past weekend, but there's not enough of that to go around just yet. Maybe if a couple of years more sustained, the WNBA does a better job of marketing it. They get an increased viewership. They get more interesting matchups than just the Caitlin, Angel Reese hate fest. More consumer interest, that will lead to more betting. But just because we build it, the betting markets, doesn't mean that they're going to come.
Well, from bettors getting down, at least to some extent, on the NFL and WNBA across the country, to bettors getting down in Wyoming, our water cooler segment this week, the Wyoming Gaming Commission last week determined sportsbook limiting isn't a concern, to which Captain Jack Andrews responded on Twitter, regulators need to be put out of business. Captain Jack responded to an original post that the state regulation of sports betting has failed, with failed in all caps. Joe, I'd like to get your thoughts on how much of this may be an exaggeration in a moment of frustration, and how much of this might point to a legitimate tipping point that could also prompt other influential voices across the space to make similar statements.
So I talked to Jack at the conference, and look, Jack's a personality. He's well known in the industry, but he's not an operator. He's not a lawmaker. He's not a lobbyist and everything like that. And I would say, based on statements like that, okay, good, because you just can't come out throwing napalm like that with anybody on the government side and expect to really get any traction. You probably can't tell anybody that they're shit to their face in any industry and then expect that they're going to cooperate with you or look into your goodwill. Okay. But I get the reaction. I have not yet seen the full report that Wyoming received from this investigator. So I haven't seen the methodology or anything like that. Yes, I was disappointed by some of the language that was being used in the reports, or like the media reports about this, about, that it's less than 1%, and that the 1% that it was were, quote, cheaters. There's no establishment of what that word means, okay? There's also no establishment of how that was determined by these operators that somehow these guys were cheating, unless it's like, the Robert De Niro scene in Casino when he's going after the hillbilly who's running his slot machines after they had a run on him, and the guy said, like, hey, how do you know these people cheated? It's like, it's a, incontrovertible way. They won, right? So if you win, somehow you're cheating. They're not really saying much about their product if that is an indicator of cheating, winning, right? But look, it's Wyoming. Wyoming has 500,000 people. They may have 2 senators, but they don't have a whole lot else going on there, okay? So I don't think that there's necessarily a representative size. It would be interesting to know what the active pool of number of Wyoming bettors there are out there. But even at that, saying like, oh, well, we're only screwing 1% of our customers really isn't a good listen either. Now, is it? I think it's more important that people take a look at this. Let's take a look at what the actual report is. We should be able to view it based on public records laws, right? So let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at the methodology. Let's see if the investigator actually, how did he look at the data? What data did he look at? Or is it merely, he interviewed the operators? Because it does sound a lot like the same line that you heard in Massachusetts and elsewhere. And so I just want to see how they approach this before really jumping off at it. But Wyoming's just the first state. There's a lot of anticipation for the thing that Massachusetts regulators are working on. We'll see how this rolls into that. But you do need to be able to, in particular, address this notion of cheating. Don't like that. I think that's the thing that we ought to come down hardest on in all of this stuff that's coming out of Wyoming.
And Adam, as Joe touched on, the Wyoming Gaming Commission concluded less than 1% of all Wyoming sports bettors are limited. Based on what you're hearing from Prime customers in Ohio and New Jersey, from BetCris customers in Arizona, and from your connections and personal experience across the industry at large, how realistic do you think that 1% figure actually is?
To be pretty close to the mark. I believe, well, that's not the case for us because we sort of invite everybody in and the first 500 are going to be assassins and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that number doesn't surprise me. I mean, even on big global operations, you're generally looking at less than 2.5%, 3% on ones that are really trying to win and beat you. And majority of those aren't in the US of that nature as well. This isn't the topic of where you can call state regulators a failure. There's many, many others where they've probably dropped the ball on or they're working on getting better at, but this isn't one. Yes, limiting players has always been the thorn in my side because I've lived it for 30 years and really hard lived it sort of 15, 20 years ago. It's just part of the game. You've just got to, accept that you can yell and scream from the highest buildings and no one's really listening to you. So you've sort of got to, that's why we're in this business. If there was no limiting and there was no restrictions and those kind of things, there's no point us doing this because ultimately they'd all be at FanDuel or DraftKings or any of these other ones. And kind of what we're building our reputation on and what we're trying to do. And the customer service aspect of it is trying to build this kind of product basing off that 1% that are getting limited elsewhere. And 20, 30 years ago, the offshore to the US was built by Pied Pipers, the best of the best being vocal that they were betting at a particular place. And then everyone else wanted to do that. That's kind of the American way of wanting to go up against the heavyweights. Even if you are a lightweight, you just want to take a shot. So if you can beat one of these books, that's kind of a jewel in your crown kind of thing. So yeah, the 1% wouldn't be far off. And I don't believe these regulators really have time, energy, or skill set to sort of push anybody to say, no limiting. I know Massachusetts have sort of spoken for quite a while about bringing in these MBLs as Australia has and things like that. But I really don't see much traction happening that. It's more of operators just changing the narrative. And now with the, the federal aspect, the predictives, Kelce, poly markets, potentially sport trade, these will pick up that 1%. But yeah, this isn't the one to hang your hat on as the state's been a failure in what they've been trying to do at this point as rookies. I mean, they're, what are we, 7 years in? I mean, there's other countries that have been doing this for 30, 40, 50 years. It'll take time, and they're just sort of still finding their feet.
From the state of Wyoming to the state of the nation, our look ahead segment, a piece of pending federal legislation could change how the U.S. taxes gambling winnings. In summary, there are two gaming related provisions. One that limits allowable deductions of gambling losses, which could threaten profitability for professional bettors, and the other changes payments related reporting thresholds, which would reduce the compliance burden for more recreational bettors. Adam, for the pro bettors that are grinding out small edges at scale, thinking of those one percenters from our water cooler segment, some of these are your customers. And how are you thinking about this in terms of how worrying this proposed bill could be and what, if anything, these bettors could do to mitigate the bill's impact on their business?
Well, the one thing I've learned very early on from the US is don't mess with the IRS. So, and I know this is I've had conversations with CPAs and tax lawyers more so in the last 12 months than ever before. And I mean, it's a massive Bible of papers and contradicting, laws and all these kind of things to try and get this right. From a non-taxable multiple countries that do not tax their gambling winners, straight up, this is just bizarre to me that this is treated as natural income when it's, seen as a windfall kind of thing, as Australia sees it, Jamaica sees it, UK sees it. So this is completely sort of tricky ground for American bettors in what they're trying to do and make this as their living, and then being able to be taxed globally on this. So you go across the pond anywhere and you find some weak books and you're successful at it, they're looking for your taxes back in the US, which to me is insane, but they're the rules of the games. It'll make it hard, but this is still also a cash business. So I don't know how much these players and whatnot are truly reporting and, the expense side of it. Again, learning that the sort of the last 6 months of having heavily documented reports of your dinners, your travels, all these kind of things you've got to log. It's almost you got to keep a second pro book of, I had dinner with X, Y, and Z. We spoke about this at this place at this time. Like, good luck to them. I mean, when I've been in the US the last sort of 6, 8, 12 months, I just haven't really bothered betting because, again, there's just this intrinsic complication that just doesn't make it worthwhile at times. So I did briefly go through this. It does seem like it's going to hamstring some of them, particularly the small ones, as you mentioned. But there's sort of bigger ones that also sort of sit on both lines as well, where they play outside and play inside, and then they report that stuff and do it and have done it above board for a very long time. But yeah, if you have a losing year, you can carry that over and all those. It's a really tricky situation to be in for all of them, trying to make a living as their primary income.
And Joe, sticking with the aspect of the bill that would reduce reporting limits for players, which would in turn reduce compliance headaches and reporting issues, just how acute of a problem has the status quo been for the average American bettor who might not necessarily understand existing reporting requirements?
The average American bettor, I don't think it affects them at all. I would be very interested to see polling of the amount of all American bettors that are even bothering to deal with this on their taxes. I mean, the number of Americans that could be getting additional deductions from their taxes is pretty significant, and the IRS is thrilled to death that they don't ever lift a finger to do anything about it. So people are already overpaying their taxes and underreporting their expenses. I don't think this really affects the 5-pick SGP parlay players very much. If you're a pro, it goes hand in hand with Jack was yelling a week ago, right? So that sports betting is not gambling, it's trading. They're like financial traders. Well, wait until you see for the average hedge funder what their tax reporting is like, what their expensing is like, how many forms deep. I mean, when you really start getting deep into the IRS catalogs of additional forms that you have to attach to your 1040, like I'm sure Adam has, I know I have, it's bewildering, but that's part of the job. That's why not everybody can do it. I think that, it's interesting. We talk about the limiting, as Adam said, it's part of the gig. This is part of the gig too. If it robs being a professional sports bettor of some of the romance that people attributed to it, like, wow, that seems like it would be really great to just bet sports. Like, hey, it was like all the people who were poker players all those years where suddenly they found out, like, well, you might be wanting to live, an Amarillo Slim lifestyle, but you're going to be paying your taxes like John Q hedge fund or Joe Q private business owner. This is big boy stuff. This is being a responsible adult. And Adam's right. Man, there's a lot of people that you could mess with and probably beveil. You will lose against the IRS every single time. So pay the tax man, no matter how unfair it seems, because not paying them is so much worse. And if you're a recreational player and you're playing for grocery money, you're just going to have to make the decision about whether or not it's worth your time to claim, a net $500 in gambling losses on your taxes. Probably most of them won't, right? But if you're a pro, and almost every pro I've talked to, if there's one thing, especially if they're living in the United States, if there's one thing that they all make sure that they have, it's a good accountant and good record keeping. Because they're not only trying to satisfy the IRS, they're trying to bulletproof themselves in case law enforcement ever happens across their front door. On the expense keeping thing, my friend Maximus, here's the one thing I want to say to people that'll help you a lot if you're worried about how do I expense this, how do I expense that? Like, you all know I'm in love with this brand, American Express. I have an American Express card. At the end of every year, they give you an itemized report that you can just hand over to your CPA that will itemize everything into every expense category. That alone probably increases my organization by 90% and reduces my cost at the CPA by 50%. And it's the easiest thing that you can do. Get yourself on Intuit software for tracking all this stuff out of your bank accounts. It's all eminently doable, but make sure you're doing it from the outset because this is not romance. There's not a romantic, dashing sports betting figure. This is adult stuff. Take it seriously from day one.
I was going to follow up, Joe, by asking you if the existing burden has turned away a meaningful number of people from participating in the ecosystem and whether or not this proposed change could convince them to come back. Sounds like you answered that resoundingly right off the bat. So we'll go ahead and close with you on this topic. Memorial Day will be here before next week's episode. And based on the conversation we had just about this time last year, I'm feeling inclined to mark the occasion by trying the Murph for the first time. Joe, would love it if you could tell our audience about what the Murph is and, more importantly, what it stands for.
So the Murph Challenge is named after Lieutenant Michael Murphy. Most of you out there may be familiar with the name through the movie Lone Survivor. Mike was a Navy SEAL who lost his life in Afghanistan and won the Medal of Honor in doing so. So every year on Memorial Day weekend, they have the Murph Challenges to raise awareness, raise money. And it consists of, and this is eminently doable, even for an old salt like me with bad knees and shoulders. It's a 1 mile run with 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 air squats, and finishing with a 1 mile run. It's a great way if you haven't started, working out to the level that you should. It's a great way to get motivated. There's a lot of camaraderie around this. It's a really great cause and couldn't be named after a better person. So give it a try this Memorial Day weekend.
And with that, we will go ahead and sign off. To the audience, whatever physical activity you may or may not have in store, thanks as always for tuning in. Have a safe and happy Memorial Day, and we'll catch you right back here next week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Prime Suspects. Register for Prime Sports at primesports.com and download the Prime Sports app. You can follow us on Twitter at PrimeSuspects_, at Joe Brennan Jr., and at Adam Bjorn 2. You must be 21 or over to play on Prime Sports. Always bet responsibly and within your limits. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER.